Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Munoz-Huber. I take the pronoun she, her, and I'm the senior producer of visual storytelling here at Audubon. Today, to celebrate the fantastic phenomenon of spring migration, we're speaking with Chad Witko, Audubon's specialist of avian biology, to talk about springtime warblers and dive into our bird migration explorer. Let's invite Chad in. And as we get started, I'd love to know what birds everyone is seeing today. Let us know in the comments. Earlier this season, I got to enjoy some timberdules in Bryant Park, and I'm been really listening to the right-throated sparrow song out in Central Park. So really curious to hear what everyone's been seeing. Hi, Chad. It's so great to see you. Thanks for being here today. Where are you joining us from? And what birds have you been seeing or hearing?
Yeah, it's so great to be here with you and with everybody viewing. So I'm coming in today from southeastern Vermont, and right now we're kind of in the heart of spring migration and seeing some wonderful birds arriving. Just this morning outside, hearing pine warblers and ruby-crowned kinglets. So a lot of fun songbirds are kind of filtering through at the moment.
Awesome. And then for folks joining, we're in the middle of spring migration when billions of birds fly from their wintering grounds to their breeding grounds. And to celebrate this amazing phenomenon, we're talking all things warblers today with Chad. As an expert birder and ornithologist, Chad Witko provides a lifetime of birding knowledge and nearly 20 years of field experience to the National Science Division here at Audubon. He's also a principal contributor to the development of the Bird Migration Explorer. More on that later. But yeah, we can start with some questions. And again, if anyone has any questions about us or for us about spring migration or warblers, please drop a comment and we'll try to answer some as we go through the conversation. Sweet. So let's start with hopefully an easy one. What is spring migration and why is it such a magical time for birders?
Yeah, so right now for folks coming, viewing in from the US and Canada, and of course other portions of the Northern Hemisphere, we're in the spring season. So spring migration is happening. And really, I want to point out that this is a pre-breeding migration. So right now, birds are streaming north to their breeding grounds, primarily to nest and raise young. And the reason why I make that distinction is, many of these species that we're seeing now as they're migrating, these are birds that spend our fall and winter outside the US, and in many cases, south of the equator, where they're experiencing spring and summer during our cooler periods. So spring migration, it's kind of a northern hemisphere term that's we're kind of biased towards here, which is okay. But it's really important to think that these birds are right now just heading north, getting ready to breed. And why is it so magical? Well, that's part of it, right? These birds are doing these amazing migrations, heading north. They're getting to their breeding grounds to fulfill this part of their life cycle, which is really awesome to witness, of course. But for many of us here in the US and Canada, what makes it so magical is we're seeing so many species for the first time in many, many months. And, spring migration, unlike fall migration, it's a little bit more condensed in time. So it's, a few months shorter than fall migration, which can start as early as summer. So we're seeing lots of birds in a short period of time. And of course, the birds we're seeing, they're in tip-top shape. They're super colorful. They're in their breeding plumages in many cases. And of course, they're very vocal as they're getting ready to establish territories and raise young.
Yeah, well, that sounds about right. That's why fall it's a little bit harder to identify them because they're a little bit drabber. But yeah, actually, so let's take a step back. Can you
Yeah.
tell us what a warbler is, what's the distinction with them?
Yeah, so of course, many birders right now are very excited about warblers, but maybe some viewers aren't really familiar with what a warbler is. So warblers are small, colorful songbirds. They belong to the family Parulidae. We call them parulids or wood warblers. And these birds are found in the Western Hemisphere, so the Americas. Now, there are some other birds in the world called warblers, things like willow warbler, which we can find in places like Europe. But the warblers we're talking about today, these are birds found right here in the Western Hemisphere of the Americas. So there's about 115 species that are found throughout this hemisphere, with more than 50 found here in the US and Canada. Now, these warblers, they fill a lot of different ecological niches, and they're found in a lot of different habitats. So if folks are interested in seeing warblers, you can find them, of course, in, urban parks and cities, of course, as they migrate. But these are birds that are found around wetlands, shrublands, and of course, forests of every type, whether it's a young or mature forest, coniferous, deciduous. These birds fill a lot of different ecological roles. And not only are they very colorful, of course, but they're also very vocal. They have some really cool songs. And these are really some of the more beloved species by birders. And I think, of course, a big portion, big part of that reason is that they are so beautiful. And they're probably rivaled in many birders' minds only by hummingbirds for being so colorful and striking.
Awesome. And then could you tell us a little bit about the warblers people in the US should be anticipate seeing soon?
Yeah, so of course, the U.S. it's a big place, and so what folks will see, really depends on where they are, and there's variations about which flyway you might be in, if you're eastern or western. If you're further south, you'll be seeing different warblers than folks who might be further north, who maybe are seeing less species. So warblers, we often think of as birders as kind of filling the heart of spring migration. There's a lot of different species, high diversity. Many of them show up when the bulk of birds are migrating through. But warblers, it's important to know, not all of them are migrating in places, where folks think that they have to wait till springtime. Some of these species, these birds have overwintered in areas. So, I know on the screen here we have yellow-rumped warbler and Townsend's warblers. These are birds that you can find in coastal areas, Townsend's out west, but yellow rumps on both coasts in the winter period. So some folks, you guys have been lucky. You guys have had warblers all year long. Now, if we kind of start in the eastern side of the continent, kind of further south, portions of the Atlantic and Mississippi flyways in the southeast, species like pine warblers, yellow-throated warblers, palm warblers, these also have been around for the bulk of the winter. We just started getting pine warblers here in New England a few weeks ago, so they're an early migrant. And palm warblers, while they are, we think of them as being tropical with palm in their name, these are birds that breed in the boreal forest. So palm warblers are streaming out of the southeast. They're heading towards their boreal breeding grounds. So many people in the eastern half of the U.S. should be experiencing palm warblers now or very soon. But of course, if you get further north in places in the eastern U.S., this time of year, April, it's still kind of early. And there's not a lot of species in yet in places like New England, but some warblers are certainly here. Here in Vermont, where I live, Louisiana water thrushes are already on territory along running streams. Black and white warblers are arriving. Black-throated green warblers are soon to be showing up. These are species that people in the Northeast, along New England, the Great Lakes. These are birds that often come through right as leaf out is just starting to happen. Now, if you go a little bit further west, you get down to the Gulf states, for instance. The Gulf states are experiencing a different variety of birds. So places like Texas, right? So right now, the Gulf is experiencing peak migration. This is why birders from all over the country, all over the world, in fact, will go to places like the Texas Gulf Coast to see, a dazzling array of warblers and other species. And right now, you guys are in peak migration. If you're down there, certainly get to the coast, see what you can see. And even species that we see later in the season here in the northern tier, birds like Cape May or blackpoll warblers, these birds are appearing in places like Florida and along the Gulf Coast or just inland. So you guys right now are in the sweet spot for the majority of good birds coming through. Now, if we go a little bit further west, say we're into the central flyway, the southern portions of that, Nashville warblers should be streaming in now. Ahead of the call, speaking with some of the folks that were getting this set up, one person was talking about Nashville warblers down around the Dallas area. They're certainly coming in. They are showing up further west in places like Oregon and Washington, but there's a coastal influence there. But inland, Nashville warblers are certainly a good bet right now, as are orange-crowned warblers. In places like Kansas, eastern Colorado, you guys should be seeing orange-crowned warblers in good numbers now or in a short period of time. If we think about places like the southwestern U.S., places like Arizona, Other species are starting to come through, but some of these birds have already been here for a while. This is a beautiful Lucy's warbler that's here on the screen. They're one of our first migrants inside the US, yellow warblers as well. These birds are arriving in places like Arizona as early as March. So these are really great birds that have been around for a little bit. But of course, interior portions north of there, you guys will be seeing more birds coming soon. And then if you go further west to the Pacific Flyway, what you see really largely depends on how coastal you are versus how inland you might be. So we had already mentioned things like Townsend's warblers along the coast, or Nashville warblers, getting further up. But things like black-throated grays, these are on the move. And as we get further north, those species will be coming in higher numbers in the next few weeks, and of course filtering in through the interior portions of the Pacific Flyway, of course, as conditions allow. These are birds that are eating insects, and they need certain conditions to allow them to kind of fall into place where people might be. So it's a really complex thing to really answer what warblers people might be seeing along the way, but there is a general pattern to understand where birds, the diversities are peaking, and there's many maps out there that kind of show these climbs based on date of where you might be, where the peak, diversity of spring migrants will be arriving. Of course, warblers tend to follow the same pattern. So, when overall diversity is highest, there tends to be more warbler diversity as well. Here's a great illustration here on this wave theory of spring migration, that shows the different periods and peaks of birds as they're coming through. So there's no shortage of kind of illustrations that are out there that people can find to help them understand when to really get outside. But another great tool that I want to mention is the Bird Migration Explorer. And it's a great tool for this personalized view of which species you can expect where you live, and of course, where those birds have been. It's a great thing to look for the journeys of migratory birds through one's region or across the hemisphere. So definitely check out the Bird Migration Explorer if you haven't yet.
Thank you so much, Chad, for giving us that amazing download of what warblers wear. We do have a question from the audience. They're asking, what are some contributing factors that make warblers migrate?
Yeah, so there's, as we mentioned, there's over 50 species that can be found in the US and Canada. So there's a great diversity of the kind of mechanics that drive warbler migration. So some of those species that we talked about, like the pine warblers and the palm warblers that are in the southeastern US, those birds aren't terribly far from where they're trying to get. And those birds are trying to kind of ride that green wave. So as vegetation is greening up and insects are emerging. So they kind of use more like local conditions. They're what we call facultative migrants. So they're able to kind of understand what's happening around them and kind of hedge their bets for what might be happening a few hundred miles north. But then there's species that are found in the tropics, south of the equator. If you're in Colombia, you don't really know the weather that's happening in Ohio. So what drives those migrations tend to be different. And those tend to be things like level, light level. So how long is daylight in certain areas? And there's other mechanics as well. But yeah, that's kind of a broad overview. But yeah, there's different things for different species depending upon their migration strategies.
I think that's really helpful, though. And then I wanted to move back towards that really cool tool you were talking about. Can you explain what the Bird Migration Explorer is?
Yeah, so the Bird Migration Explorer, it's a free browser-based tool. It's available in English and Spanish. And again, it's browser-based, so you can use it on your computer, tablet, or mobile devices of choice on any browser that you like. It's not an app, so you just have to go to Google Chrome or Safari and look for Bird Migration Explorer. You'll find it. And it was launched in 2022, and it was created by Audubon and 9 founding partners. And of course, there's all kinds of data on there. So, there's data from hundreds of researchers and institutions across the hemisphere, folks that have contributed their hard-earned tracking data and other data to the platform. And what it is it's a tool that kind of shows the wonder of migration through these interactive maps that you're seeing on the screen. And these maps are built from, cutting edge tracking data and conservation science data as well. And it allows kind of folks to see how birds connect people across borders, landscapes, cultures. It helps with stewardship and getting people to understand that, protecting these birds is kind of protecting a shared future. And there's no shortage of the birds that are on there. There's 458 species of migratory birds that breed in the US and Canada, traveling throughout the Western Hemisphere. And related to this talk, there's nearly 50 species of warblers that are on the platform. So the platform has over 11,000 migration tracks, nearly 200 species in total, and of course, 6 million connections, many of which are coming from banding data. So it's just this amazing platform that viewers should check out if they haven't yet. And, the migration maps that we have, where you can look at the species migrations, many people think of this as the crown jewel of the platform. You can see where these birds are going, but there's so much more, and folks can look at our locations maps, and they can find out how their home or place of interest connects to other places throughout the hemisphere through our birds. And then also look at conservation challenge maps and see what birds are facing which kind of threats or risks, or which challenges that or opportunities we have for conservation, and we can understand where conservation action is most needed through the hemisphere. So just an amazing tool that I can't speak highly enough about. So check it out if you haven't.
Awesome. And then, so you talked about all of these different ways that these birds are tracked. How are these birds being tracked? Like, how do we have this information or this data?
Yeah, so there's thousands of researchers out there tracking birds throughout the world, throughout the Western Hemisphere, North America, and birds are tracked using different technologies. So, the choice of tracking technology really depends on a few things. These include the species size, their life history. These birds that are forest birds, birds on the open ocean. The other thing is what research or conservation questions are being asked by the researchers. So, what is being used depends on a lot of factors. And then, of course, there's different types of tags. So some tags are able to connect to satellites or cellular towers, transmitting data. So, researchers can access that data, sometimes nearly real time. And then other data, devices, tracking devices, they collect the data, they log it, and then the tracking devices need to be retrieved, oftentimes the next year, to gain that data, which is then analyzed. So while there's a large variety, obviously we think about something like warblers, we're not going to put a heavy backpack on a bird. We're going to use something much smaller. So these birds require smaller, lightweight tags. And a great example of this are the nano tags that work with the MODIS wildlife tracking system. You can see some examples here on the screen. The MODIS is a great system that Audubon is happy to collaborate with and support. So these nano tags are used with that system. It's something that many people are probably starting to hear about if they haven't already. Researchers will also deploy lightweight geolocators, and sometimes those are lightweight light level geolocators. So these will estimate a bird's position based on daylight levels. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of goes back to some of our early navigational principles, from early explorers. So we can triangulate on the Earth where a bird is based on the light levels that the devices collect. And then there are also newly developed barometric geolocators. So these tags basically collect atmospheric pressure data, and we can compare that to barometric data maps to help understand where a bird is, not only on the Earth, but how high in altitude they are when they're migrating. So a lot of cool devices that are out there for these small birds like warblers.
That's so cool. And then, so how might birders take advantage of the Bird Migration Explorer during a time like spring migration?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Explorer is a great tool to use in any time of year, right? It's a great thing if you're just sitting on the couch in wintertime, pull it up. There's a whole lot of stuff to learn. But yeah, during springtime, it's a great tool for kind of understanding the migration life histories of these birds, or the ones you are seeing, or maybe the ones you want to see. So If you pull up a species map, you can understand perhaps, where that species is going, where they've been, the timing of their migrations. And it really helps people understand kind of the hemispheric reach that these birds have and how they're connecting not only habitats and ecosystems, but also people and communities throughout the hemisphere. It helps people, I think one important thing is it helps people understand their role as stewards, perhaps, and seeing how their local habitats or patches, their yards, kind of interconnect, with other habitats throughout the hemisphere that these birds rely on. So here we have a map of Connecticut warblers. So Connecticut warblers, they're these large warbler, but despite their size, they're super secretive. It's a bird that many birders, really try hard to see. It's a bird that I don't see every year. And by looking at an Explorer map like this, we can understand a little bit more about the main areas, the regions that they breed or overwinter, but also see some of their general pathways as a species. So, we can learn a whole lot just by taking in and looking at maps like this, where we can see birds are migrating and where they're going. And ultimately, I think in doing this, we become better stewards of not only the birds, but the places that they love and require to get through a year.
Yeah, I think like one of the things that I like the most about exploring the Bird Migration Explorer is just realizing these birds that I'm seeing now are the same birds that other people like thousands of miles away from me are also seeing at a different time. It's just really, it boggles the mind. They're really
Yeah,
quite impressive little creatures.
yeah, and it really helps us realize that there's such a shared experience, and we think of our local birds that we see in our yard or our local birding patch, but yeah, these are birds that are shared by thousands of people, millions of people, right, across the world, and it helps us understand why it's important to protect them.
Yeah, and so look, speaking of like why it's important to protect them, from a scientist perspective, why is it important that scientists know where birds are during periods of migration?
That's a good question. I think, initially for some species, trying to understand where a bird goes, I think some of it is just satisfying this curiosity, right? We didn't know, like some birds were thought to be more rare because we just didn't know where they went. It was this kind of these black boxes, these empty data points. We just didn't know where they go. So there's always a curiosity there. But I think that there's a conservation component that's really important. So when scientists can study birds and study where they go, not only do we know where they breed and maybe where they winter, but we can also identify these critical stopover or staging areas that are equally as important to survival, but may be unprotected. Migration data, it helps us understand how species connect landscapes, right? And helps us understand these ecological linkages, as well as kind of shared conservation responsibilities. So if we understand where birds are going, if we're a conservation organization protecting a bird locally, we can see where they're going now and maybe work with conservation areas in those regions to help protect these birds that are important to us where we might live or work. So right here we have a map of a blackpoll warbler on the screen from the Explorer. And blackpoll warblers, these are fantastic migrants. They have these amazing migrations that they do out over the ocean every spring, and they're a bird that we see, throughout the eastern part of the continent in migration. Of course, they breed all the way from Newfoundland to Alaska. But by understanding where these birds go, we can learn a lot. So, recent research has shown that some of these migratory connections, so places that species use, where they breed to where they might winter, connections like here we have Canada to South America. Some of these migration connections are facing, greater risks from anticipated global change. These broad areas, that we're showing here obviously are utilized by blackpoll warblers. That's their map. But these are areas that, dozens of warbler species are breeding and, of course, overwintering. So by understanding where they go, we understand kind of like what we need to do to support them. And in the case of blackpoll warblers, this was a common species, but they've declined a lot. Some 92% estimates from places like Partners in Flight, have shown that they've declined that much since the 1970s. So better understanding these connections helps support more informed conservation efforts and helps protect them throughout their full annual cycle.
And then like, so speaking, I guess, like more broadly to like what these challenges are, like what do warblers face when they're like during migration? Like what are some of these like issues that come up for them?
Yeah, so we were just looking at a Blackpoll warbler map, and like their migration covers, I mean, a huge portion of the eastern U.S. Now, if you add all those warbler species together, there's really like almost every corner of the U.S. that's not, barren, right, or open ocean. Although they do migrate over the open ocean, you know, warblers are experiencing what's happening in those areas, right? So they're heading from North America to the Caribbean, Latin America, and there's a lot of altered landscapes that they're facing along the way. So light pollution, generally speaking, is a big one during migration, particularly in large urban areas or suburban areas. These can disorient birds when they're migrating, and that kind of increases this risk of collision, which is a major driver for bird loss. This is why initiatives like lights out programs are really so important for us to understand and to employ. Habitat loss and habitat, alterations, of course, is another big threat for warblers throughout their full annual cycle. There's no area, I think, that really isn't seeing some levels of expanding development or altered landscape, and this can really fragment or eliminate these critical habitats that they rely on, throughout their journey. So, especially while they're migrating. So, yeah, there's a lot that they face, and a lot of it comes from these altered landscapes.
That makes sense. And then would you say that they face the same like severity of challenges during both the like I guess from a North American perspective from both fall and spring migration?
Yeah, I mean, these birds are migrating in some cases thousands of miles, and whether it's spring or fall, they're certainly facing some of the same threats in both pre and post breeding migration periods. But there's a new study from Audubon scientists that found that fall migration really is a more dangerous season for warblers. Every year there's billions of birds that are streaming out of that boreal forest, and if folks don't know, that's this kind of unbroken forest from Alaska to Newfoundland. It's one of the largest intact forests on the planet, and it's a bird nursery. It really is what it is. And so billions of birds are streaming out of this each fall, and no small percentage of that is these juvenile birds, right? So these are birds that were just hatched. These are birds that are going purely on instinct. They have no prior migration experience. So it's not surprising that these birds are facing threats with less experience, less efficiency of navigation. They're more likely to encounter hazards. So fall is a really tough time for warblers, and that's a really big part of that.
Yeah, and so we've been talking a lot about the different challenges that they face, and we've touched briefly on like how humans are part of that challenge. What are some actions though that like people can take to help make these birds make these like really long and intense journeys?
Yep. So when I think about how we can help our birds, one of the first things that I always come back to is that the more we know, the more we care, right? And so if people are interested in helping to protect our birds, I think there's a great first step is learning more about them. And so tools like the Bird Migration Explorer that we showed, Audubon has their bird guide app. We have our online guide to North American birds. These are all free resources, and they're easy ways to kind of deepen this knowledge that will help us kind of learn more and care more. Beyond that, if folks are able, I know not everybody has green space to do this, but if folks can plant native plants, that's a really huge one for warblers and all species, to be honest. But warblers, these are primarily insectivorous birds. Some do transition to other food sources in migration, but it really all comes down to plants. Without plants, we don't have the insects that support them in migration that they need. And of course, native plants, if these birds are coming through, they provide safe places to rest, places to roost, and of course, breeding. They need all kinds of native plants to successfully breed. And of course, if folks are interested in improving their native plants for either where they live or where they frequent, we have at Audubon a great native plant database that is such a great resource that I think people can get started. And of course, once you go there, there's no shortage in some areas of wonderful native plant nurseries that people can frequent for good plants. And of course, right at home, right, making our home safer for birds. We mentioned lights out, so turning off unnecessary lights at night, especially during migration. You can use the Bird Migration Explorer to kind of get a sense of when these migrations are happening. But then there's also things like Birdcast, which can tell folks when there's these big pulses of migration happening in their local area. So there's definitely resources out there to help you understand when you can turn off your lights. And of course, treating windows if you can. Warblers, these are nocturnal migrants, so they get disoriented by a lot of lights. And then of course, if they get disoriented, they get around a lot of glass. Those things can be fatal. So turning off lights and making our windows more bird friendly are great ways to do that. And of course, we have Audubon's Lights Out program to help guide people on how to do that.
Yeah, there's just so many different ways that you can get involved. Like especially even if you're in a city like I am, I'm in New York City, and you can get involved with your own building to try to mitigate. It can happen on such a small local level, which I think is so fantastic because it's something you can easily see too. It's something we can also change. And it seems like in the comments people have been talking about how they participate in Lights Out programs across the country, which is so great to hear. It really, the small things that we can do make a big difference. And we also have a question from the audience, and they're asking, how long can some warblers fly without stopping? Do we know?
Yeah, so when we think about some of these warblers, right, we show blackpoll warbler, migrating out over the ocean. It takes a few days for those birds to steam kind of under their own power, because these birds, if they land on the water, they can't swim, they can't float, right? So that'll be the end of their journey, unfortunately. So some birds can take 2 or 3 days out over the ocean. Many of our trans-Gulf migrants, so birds that are flying over the Gulf from Mexico to the U.S., they can do that in a day. And there's all kinds of things that will challenge them along the way and maybe make their journeys longer or shorter, things like wind and weather, right? But yeah, these birds, what they're doing is they're eating a lot of insects, they're putting a lot of fat. This is why our native plants are so important. And they're gaining these fat reserves that are basically like their little, jet packs that help fuel them for these journeys as they're migrating. So yeah, really incredible.
Yeah, that's such a great way to think about it. The extra nutrition food is like jetpacks to literally launch their way up north. That's so fantastic. Thank you so much, Chad, for joining us today to talk all things spring warblers. We do have to ask though, as we ask everyone, what is your spark bird?
Yeah, I mean, I do love warblers for sure. I get super excited. I got super excited seeing a black and white warbler the other day and hearing the pine warbler. So they are near and dear to my heart. And I love so many other birds like seabirds, but for me, waterfowl. Waterfowl were my spark bird as a kid. I've been birding a long time, and yeah, ducks and geese really were it for me when I was just a young lad.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the first, I don't know, depending on where you grew up, one of the first birds you encounter that's like, oh, what's that? That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Well, it was such a pleasure to chat with you today, Chad. And thanks everyone for tuning in. We really can't do this without your support. And if you want to support our work to protect birds and the places they need, you can visit audubon.org/donate to make a donation. And don't forget to check out what birds, warblers, and otherwise are flying through your neighborhood this migration season by visiting thebirdmigrationexplorer.com. Thank you all, and I hope you all have a great day and a great happy migration season.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks.